The gavel echoed through the courtroom, silencing the restless crowd. Ava Jackson, visibly pregnant but standing tall, met the judge's smug grin with a steady gaze. "Well, Miss Jackson," Judge Wallace sneered, "do you really think this court has time for your sob story?" What he didn't know was that the woman he was mocking wasn't just another plaintiff. She was a decorated lawyer. And today, she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was about to shatter his arrogance for good. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. Ava Jackson adjusted the strap of her modest navy blue bag as she stood outside the heavy oak doors of the small-town courthouse. The sun blazed high overhead, and the heat was oppressive. But it wasn't the weather that weighed on her. She glanced down at her growing belly, her hand instinctively resting against the curve. At 8 months pregnant, every step took effort. But Ava wasn't here to show weakness. She was here to fight. The courthouse's old, faded bricks and worn steps reflected the town's age, a place where tradition and stagnation seemed to blend. As Ava stepped inside, the cool air of the lobby did little to soothe the tension in her shoulders. "Name?" asked the clerk at the front desk, a woman whose disinterest was as palpable as her acrylic nails tapping the keyboard. "Ava Jackson. I'm here for my hearing," Ava replied, her voice steady but soft. "Courtroom 3, the clerk said, barely looking up. Ava nodded and made her way down the corridor, her heels clicking softly against the tiled floor. As she entered the courtroom, all eyes turned toward her. She was used to the looks by now, some curious, others pitying, and a few judgmental. Her crisp white blouse and simple black skirt were professional, yet plain, reflecting her tight finances. The weight of the room's gaze pressed on her as she walked to the plaintiff's table. The courtroom itself seemed frozen in time, with its wooden benches, outdated microphones, and a faded American flag in one corner. It was a stark contrast to the cases Ava had handled years ago in bustling metropolitan courtrooms before she left her career. Now she was here not as a lawyer, but as a plaintiff, seeking justice for herself and her unborn child. Behind the elevated bench sat Judge Randolph Wallace, a man whose presence dominated the room, not because of his stature, but his air of authority. His salt and pepper hair was slicked back, and his sharp features carried a permanent expression of smug condescension. He adjusted his robes, leaned back in his chair, and stared down at Ava with a raised eyebrow. "Well, well, Miss Jackson," he drawled, his southern accent dripping with insincerity. "Looks like you've gone and found yourself in quite the predicament." A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom, and Ava's face remained impassive, though her knuckles whitened as she gripped her notes. "Your Honor, I'm here today because my landlord unlawfully evicted me," she began, her voice calm but firm. "Despite my pregnancy, he—" "Hold on now," Judge Wallace interrupted, waving a dismissive hand. "Let me stop you right there. A landlord doesn't just evict a tenant for no reason. Were you late on rent? Forget to pay? Or were there other reasons?" His thin smile hinted at malice, and the courtroom murmured. Ava swallowed hard, her resolve steeling. "I was not late on rent, Your Honor. My landlord evicted me after learning I was pregnant and accused me of being unable to care for the property." Judge Wallace leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. "And why, pray tell, would he think that? Pregnancy doesn't exactly leave a house in shambles, does it? Unless you're prone to letting things go." The courtroom erupted in nervous laughter. Ava clenched her fists under the table, her heart pounding in her chest. "Your Honor," she said, her voice rising just enough to reclaim the room's attention. "This is not about my ability to maintain a property. This is about discrimination. My landlord made baseless assumptions about me as a pregnant woman." Judge Wallace waved her off with a scoff. "Baseless, you say? Maybe he just didn't want someone with a delicate condition to cause trouble." The words hung in the air like a slap. Ava bit the inside of her cheek, willing herself to remain composed. "Your Honor," Ava pressed on, "I have documentation of my rent payments and written statements from neighbors who witnessed the eviction notice being posted. I'm confident this court will see the clear violation of tenant rights." Judge Wallace leaned back in his chair, a smug grin spreading across his face. "Miss Jackson, I'm not sure you understand how things work around here. You've got your evidence, sure, But I've seen tenants like you, crying foul over every little inconvenience. Tell me, how does a pregnant woman plan to defend herself when she's up against experienced lawyers? Ava's jaw tightened, and for a moment the courtroom felt suffocatingly silent. The judge's words weren't just dismissive, they were meant to humiliate her. The room seemed to pulse with the tension of an unspoken truth. This wasn't justice. This was prejudice. But Ava wasn't just any pregnant woman. And Judge Wallace, for all his smug confidence, was about to learn that. Ava took a deep breath and steadied her trembling hands as she stood to address the court. The small-town courtroom was alive with an almost tangible tension. Spectators whispered behind their hands, their eyes darting between Ava and the man presiding over her case, Judge Randolph Wallace. "So," Randolph began, leaning forward with a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Miss Jackson, you're here claiming discrimination. A bold accusation for someone who, let's face it, might be feeling the effects of, let's say, hormones. Isn't that right?" Laughter broke out from the opposing side of the courtroom, faint but cruel. Ava's lips tightened, but she didn't flinch. Her chin lifted ever so slightly, a silent testament to her resolve. "Your Honor, this isn't about me personally. This is about a violation of tenant rights," she responded, her voice steady but firm. "My landlord illegally evicted you." Yes, we've heard that part," Randolph interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. "But what I'm struggling to understand is why. What would your landlord gain by evicting someone in your condition?" He let his gaze drift pointedly to her rounded belly, the smirk on his face sharpening into something far crueler. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Some looked at Ava with pity, others with quiet outrage. Randolph's condescension was palpable, his gaze settling on Ava as though she were a curiosity rather than a person. "I have sworn affidavits from my neighbors," Ava said, pulling herself taller, her hands steadying the papers she held. "They witnessed him post the notice and heard him say I was a liability he couldn't afford." Randolph leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Liability, Well, pregnancy can certainly cause some disruptions. Maybe he was worried about a safety issue or..." He paused, chuckling to himself. "Or perhaps he was just being practical. I mean, have you looked at yourself? No offense, but you're not exactly giving the impression of someone capable of handling much right now." Ava's jaw tightened, but her gaze remained fixed on the judge. He was baiting her, and she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "Your Honor, if I may," Ava interjected, her voice cutting through the courtroom's growing unease. "This isn't about how I appear to handle anything. It's about the illegal actions of my landlord, who assumed my pregnancy made me undeserving of stable housing." Randolph raised a single eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Stable housing? Miss Jackson, forgive me for saying this, but if you're struggling so much that you're representing yourself in court, perhaps your landlord wasn't entirely wrong in questioning your situation." The air in the courtroom grew thick with tension. Whispers spread like wildfire among the spectators, some visibly appalled at the judge's blatant lack of professionalism. Ava heard someone mutter, "This isn't right," but she kept her focus on Randolph. "I came here today," Ava said, her voice gaining strength, "because I believe in the justice system. I believe that no matter one's situation, the law is meant to protect everyone equally, including pregnant women." Randolph rolled his eyes, a small chuckle escaping his lips. "That's quite a speech, Miss Jackson. You wouldn't happen to have rehearsed that in front of a mirror, would you? Although with those legal terms you're throwing around, you might just convince someone who doesn't know better." The mockery stung, but Ava stood firm. She glanced at the spectators, noting the way their murmurs had grown louder. She could feel the collective weight of their unspoken support, and it bolstered her resolve. "Your Honor," Ava continued, her voice unwavering, "if my landlord thought I was a liability, that's discrimination, plain and simple. My financial struggles don't negate my rights as a tenant, and the law is clear. Evicting someone without notice is illegal." Randolph leaned forward, his smug grin widening. "Oh, the law is clear, is it? How interesting to hear you say that, Miss Jackson. Tell me, did you pick up that little nugget from a law book you checked out from the library?" He laughed, And this time it wasn't just a chuckle. It was a full-bodied, unapologetic laugh that echoed through the courtroom. The sound was jarring, cutting through the air like a blade. Even the courtroom clerk looked uncomfortable as the judge's laughter faded into silence. Ava's hand tightened around her notes, her knuckles turning white. "Your Honor, my right to present my case shouldn't be dependent on your opinion of me." Her tone was calm, but there was steel beneath the words. Randolph tilted his head as if considering her statement. "Fair enough," he said, though his tone betrayed his lack of sincerity. "But let's not pretend this is some groundbreaking civil rights case. At best, it's a misunderstanding between a landlord and a tenant. At worst—" He smirked again, pausing for dramatic effect. "It's a waste of this court's time." The murmur of disapproval among the spectators grew louder. Ava caught the eye of an older woman in the back row, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. It was a fleeting moment, but it was enough to keep her going. Randolph adjusted his robe and sighed theatrically. "Fine, Miss Jackson. Present your so-called evidence. But I'll warn you, your little speech better be good enough to convince me this isn't just a pity party." Ava met his gaze, her eyes blazing with quiet determination. "Don't worry, Your Honor," she said. "I'm just getting started." Ava shifted slightly in her seat, her fingers grazing the edges of her papers. The courtroom's tension hung heavy, but Ava's focus was razor-sharp. Judge Randolph Wallace smirked, tapping his gavel lightly against his bench, as though this were merely a game to him. "So, Miss Jackson," he drawled, leaning back in his chair, "let's see if you've got anything else to say before I decide whether or not this ordeal deserves my attention." His tone was laced with mockery, the smug confidence of a man who believed he had already won. Ava took a steady breath and rose to her feet, the quiet strength in her posture commanding more respect than the judge's words ever could. "Your Honor," she began, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge, "I'd like to draw your attention to Section 83 of the state's Landlord-Tenant Code." A flicker of surprise crossed Randolph's face, quickly masked by his usual condescension. "Oh, is that so?" he said, feigning interest. "I didn't realize we had a legal scholar in our midst. Please, enlighten us." Ava met his gaze directly, refusing to flinch. Section 83 clearly outlines that landlords must provide at least 30 days written notice before initiating an eviction. My landlord posted the notice on my door without warning and gave me 24 hours to vacate. That's a violation of state law. The judge's smirk faltered ever so slightly, though he quickly recovered. "That's a nice little tidbit, Miss Jackson," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "But quoting a law doesn't make you a lawyer." Ava allowed herself a small smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "You're absolutely right, Your Honor," she replied. "Quoting a law doesn't make me a lawyer. However, practicing law for nearly a decade does." The room went silent. The shift in the air was palpable, as if every spectator had collectively held their breath. Randolph blinked, his hand pausing mid-tap on the gavel. "Excuse me?" he said, his tone suddenly less assured. Ava's expression didn't change, but there was a quiet power in the way she stood. "After graduating summa cum laude from Columbia Law School," she began, her voice steady, "I spent 8 years as a trial attorney specializing in civil rights litigation. My work included several high-profile cases against discriminatory housing practices, cases that, I might add, resulted in favorable rulings for my clients." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, the spectators exchanging shocked glances. Even the opposing counsel shifted uneasily in his seat, suddenly looking more interested in his notes. Randolph leaned forward, his smug grin replaced by a tight, thin-lipped frown. "That's quite the tale, Miss Jackson. And yet here you are, representing yourself in a tenant dispute. How noble of you to step down from such lofty heights." Ava didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she continued, her tone unwavering. "I left my career to focus on my family, Your Honor. That doesn't change the fact that the law is clear, and my landlord violated it." As she spoke, flashes of her past played vividly in her mind. She remembered the late nights spent poring over case files, the exhilaration of standing before a jury, the weight of responsibility that came with defending the powerless. She had thrived in the courtroom, her sharp mind and unrelenting determination earning her a reputation as a force to be reckoned with. But when she and her husband decided to start a family, Ava had made the difficult choice to step away from her career. That decision hadn't been easy, and the challenges that followed, her husband's unexpected passing, the financial strain, the judgment she faced as a single mother, had tested her resilience in ways she couldn't have imagined. But standing here now, facing Judge Wallace's disdain, she felt that same fire she had once carried in the courtroom. Randolph, meanwhile, was losing his composure. He cleared his throat, his face flushed as he struggled to maintain control. "So you're telling me," he said, his voice louder than necessary, "that you, a lawyer, are standing here wasting this court's time over a little eviction?" Ava didn't miss a beat. "It's not a little eviction, Your Honor," she said firmly. "It's a blatant act of discrimination. And while you may think this case doesn't matter, I assure you, it matters to me, and it matters to the law." The spectators murmured again, this time with a note of approval. Randolph shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his earlier confidence eroding with every word Ava spoke. "You see, Your Honor," Ava continued, "I may not be wearing a suit or sitting behind a legal team, but I know my rights, and I know this court is bound to uphold them." Randolph glared at her, his hand gripping the gavel tightly. "We'll see about that," he muttered, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. The tide was shifting, and Ava could feel it. The judge's arrogance, once so overwhelming, now seemed desperate. A man clinging to a crumbling facade. And Ava wasn't finished yet. Judge Randolph Wallace's gavel slammed against the bench, the sharp crack echoing through the tense courtroom. "Miss Jackson," he said, his voice thick with derision, "I've been patient with your theatrics, but my courtroom is no place for amateur dramatics. Do you even understand what you're asking for?" Ava Jackson stood her ground, her gaze steady as she adjusted the stack of documents on the table before her. Her calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the judge's growing irritation. "Your Honor, I'm simply asking for this court to uphold the law," she said, her voice even but firm. Randolph scoffed, leaning back in his chair and folding his arms. "The law?" he repeated, drawing out the words as if mocking their very existence. "I've seen people like you come in here with big words and baseless claims, hoping to win on pity alone. But let me remind you, Miss Jackson, that this is a court of law, not a charity." The spectators exchanged uneasy glances, the room buzzing with muted whispers. Ava let the weight of his words settle before responding, her composure unshaken. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she began, "this case isn't about pity. It's about justice. My landlord violated my rights under Section 83 of the Landlord-Tenant Code. As you know, the law explicitly prohibits evictions without proper notice." Randolph waved his hand dismissively, cutting her off mid-sentence. "Enough of this nonsense. I've heard all I need to hear. You're wasting this court's time with your baseless accusations." Ava's fingers tightened around the edge of the table, but she remained poised. "Your Honor, the law is clear. My landlord's actions were illegal, and I have the evidence to prove it." Randolph's eyes narrowed, his irritation spilling over into outright hostility. "And I'm telling you, Miss Jackson, that I've seen nothing but conjecture and hearsay. You're not a lawyer anymore, so stop pretending you know how this works." The air in the courtroom grew thick with tension. Randolph's words hung like a dark cloud, his attempt to belittle Ava unmistakable. But Ava didn't flinch. "Your Honor," she said calmly, stepping toward the lectern with a confidence that sent ripples through the room. "If you would indulge me for a moment, I'd like to direct your attention to Turner v. Monroe Housing Authority, a 2004 case in which the court ruled in favor of a tenant facing an identical situation to mine." The judge froze, his smirk faltering for the briefest of moments. His eyes darted to the clerk, who was already scrambling to locate the case on her computer. "And," Ava continued, her voice steady and deliberate, "if that precedent isn't sufficient, I'd also like to cite Baker v. Westfield Properties, where the court found that a landlord's discriminatory actions against a pregnant tenant were grounds for punitive damages." The murmurs in the room grew louder, the spectators leaning forward as they realized Ava wasn't just a disgruntled tenant with a sob story. She was methodical, precise, and completely in command of the law. Randolph's face darkened, a flush creeping up his neck as he struggled to regain control. "Miss Jackson," he said, his tone sharp, This isn't a law school debate. This is a courtroom. Your attempts to hijack my proceedings with irrelevant citations won't work here. Respectfully, Your Honor, Ava countered, her voice unwavering. These citations are directly relevant. They establish precedent for cases involving unlawful eviction and discrimination. I would be happy to provide additional examples if needed. Randolph's hand tightened around his gavel, his knuckles white. He opened his mouth to speak, but Ava continued, her words cutting through the air with razor-sharp precision. In fact, she said, I've already included these precedents in the evidence I submitted to the court. I believe you'll find the documents quite comprehensive. The courtroom fell silent. Even the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed to fade as all eyes turned to the judge. Randolph's confident facade was cracking, the smug grin replaced by a clenched jaw and narrowed eyes. Miss Jackson, he said through gritted teeth, this court does not tolerate grandstanding. I strongly suggest you reconsider your approach before I dismiss this case outright. Ava held his gaze, unshaken by the threat. Your Honor, she replied, her tone measured. With all due respect, dismissing this case without reviewing the evidence would constitute a gross miscarriage of justice. And if that were to happen, I would have no choice but to file an appeal with the circuit court. The room erupted into whispers, the weight of Ava's words settling over the courtroom like a thunderclap. Randolph's face turned crimson, his earlier bravado now replaced with a mix of frustration and unease. Order, he barked, slamming his gavel down. The noise echoed through the room, but it did little to silence the spectators. Ava stepped back, her calm expression never wavering. She had made her point, and the courtroom knew it. Randolph's authority, once absolute, now felt shaky and uncertain. The judge glared at her, his voice taut with anger. Miss Jackson, you may proceed. But I warn you, any further attempts to undermine this court will not be tolerated. Understood, Your Honor, Ava said, her voice steady and resolute. She returned to her seat, her head held high, as the weight of her quiet triumph rippled through the room. For the first time, the courtroom saw Ava not as a victim, but as a formidable force. And Randolph, for all his arrogance, was beginning to realize that he had underestimated her. The courtroom was so silent, Ava Jackson could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. The weight of her words hung in the air as all eyes rested on her. She stood tall, her hand steady as she reached into her bag, pulling out two items that gleamed even under the muted fluorescent lighting. A framed award bearing the seal of the National Bar Association, and a pristine certificate with bold lettering at the top that read, Ava Jackson, Esky. This, Ava said, her voice ringing clear and unwavering, is my award for contributions to landmark civil rights cases, presented by the National Bar Association. And this, she added, lifting the certificate, is my official Bar Association certification, issued to me after graduating summa cum laude from Columbia Law. The gasps were audible, rippling through the spectators like a wave. Even the opposing counsel leaned forward, their mouths slightly agape. The once dismissive murmurs in the courtroom had transformed into whispers of astonishment. Judge Randolph Wallace's smug grin faltered. His sharp features seemed to tighten as if he were trying to process what he had just seen. His fingers gripped the edge of his bench, knuckles white against the dark wood. Your Honor, Ava continued, her tone steady but cutting, I'm not here to seek pity. I'm not here because I lack knowledge of the law. I'm here because my landlord broke the law, and as a former trial attorney with nearly a decade of experience in civil rights litigation, I am fully capable of proving that. The judge blinked, his usual composure cracking under the weight of her revelation. His lips moved as though he were about to speak, but no words came out. For a moment he looked like a man caught in his own arrogance, scrambling to regain control. Ava pressed on, her voice commanding the room. I fought cases against housing discrimination, wage theft, and employment bias. I've stood in front of juries, argued in appellate courts, and negotiated settlements that changed lives. And yet, she paused, her gaze locking on Randolph. You treated me as though I were some clueless, helpless victim unworthy of this court's attention. The judge's face reddened, his discomfort visible as the whispers among the spectators grew louder. Randolph cleared his throat, attempting to reassert authority. Miss Jackson, he began. But Ava cut him off with a sharp look. "No, Your Honor," she said, her voice rising slightly. "You've spent this entire hearing dismissing me, mocking me, and questioning my competence. And now, when faced with the truth, you're struggling to maintain your facade of impartiality." Her words hit like a hammer, each syllable reverberating through the courtroom. The older woman seated in the back row nodded approvingly, her face reflecting a quiet triumph. Others exchanged glances, their initial pity for Ava now replaced with admiration and respect. Randolph shifted in his chair, his earlier bravado crumbling under the intensity of Ava's gaze. "I was simply conducting my courtroom as I see fit," he said, though his voice lacked its usual authority. "Conducting your courtroom?" Ava repeated, her tone razor-sharp. "Or abusing your power to belittle someone you assumed was beneath you?" The judge opened his mouth to respond but hesitated, the words dying on his lips. For once, he had no clever retort, no smug quip to deflect the truth. "I came here today," Ava continued, her voice softer now, but no less powerful, "because I believe in the justice system. I believe that it can protect people like me. Single mothers, tenants, individuals who are often overlooked or dismissed. But today, Your Honor, you've shown this courtroom the very prejudice that I've spent my career fighting against." The spectators erupted in applause, a few even standing as they clapped. Randolph slammed his gavel against the bench, his face a mask of frustration and embarrassment. "Order!" he barked, though his voice carried none of the commanding presence it had before. Ava didn't flinch. She placed her credentials on the table, a quiet yet defiant reminder of the strength and expertise he had chosen to ignore. As she sat down, the applause died down, but the energy in the room remained electric. For the first time that day, Judge Randolph Wallace looked at Ava Jackson not with disdain, but with the faintest glimmer of fear. She was no ordinary plaintiff. She was a force to be reckoned with, and he had underestimated her at every turn. The courtroom settled into silence once more, but the balance of power had irrevocably shifted. Ava's calm demeanor and undeniable credentials had dismantled Randolph's arrogance in front of everyone. And as she met his gaze, the faintest smile touched her lips, a smile that said, "Checkmate." The courtroom buzzed with a low hum of tension as Ava Jackson rose from her seat, her framed award and bar certificate still resting on the table beside her. All eyes were on her, but this time there was no pity or doubt in their gazes. The spectators leaned forward, captivated by the woman who had just unraveled Judge Randolph Wallace's facade of authority. Even the opposing counsel, who had been confident moments ago, now fidgeted nervously with his tie. Ava took a deep breath, her voice steady as she began. "Your Honor, and everyone present in this courtroom, what we've witnessed here today is not just about one case. It's about a pattern, a deeply ingrained system that favors power over principle and prejudice over justice." The murmurs among the spectators grew louder. Randolph glared at the room, raising his gavel. "Order!" he barked, though his voice lacked its usual command. Ava didn't falter. She turned to face the gallery, addressing them as much as she was addressing the bench. "When I walked into this courtroom today, visibly pregnant and without legal representation, I was dismissed as unworthy of being taken seriously. My rights, my dignity, and even my abilities were questioned, not because of the merits of my case, but because of assumptions about who I am." Her voice grew stronger, each word ringing with conviction. "And who am I? I'm a woman who has spent years fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. I'm a lawyer who has stood in courtrooms just like this one, arguing for tenants, workers, and families who were wronged by people in power. And yet, despite my experience and knowledge, I was treated like I didn't belong here." Randolph's face turned a deeper shade of red. "Miss Jackson, I suggest you stick to the facts of your case," he snapped, his tone betraying his growing discomfort. Ava's sharp gaze locked onto him. "The facts of my case, Your Honor, are rooted in discrimination. And the truth is, this discrimination doesn't stop with landlords. It exists here, in this courtroom, in the very system that's supposed to protect us." The courtroom erupted in whispers, and even the bailiff seemed unsure whether to intervene. Randolph slammed his gavel again, his hand trembling. I will not allow this courtroom to devolve into chaos, he shouted. Chaos? Ava repeated, her voice rising just enough to cut through the noise. What's chaotic is a system where a judge feels entitled to mock and belittle someone simply because they don't fit his narrow idea of who deserves respect. What's chaotic is the message this sends to everyone watching, that justice is only for the privileged, the powerful, and the acceptable. Her words struck like lightning, igniting a wave of murmurs among the spectators. Randolph sat rigid in his chair, his earlier arrogance replaced with visible unease. Your Honor, Ava continued, her voice steadying as she shifted her focus back to her case. This is not just about me. It's about every tenant who has been forced out of their home without cause. Every mother who has been underestimated, and every person who has been told they don't matter. I am here today not just to win my case, but to remind this court that the law is meant to serve everyone, not just those deemed worthy by the powerful. For a moment, the room was utterly silent. Then, one by one, heads began to nod. The older woman in the back row whispered to her neighbor, who nodded emphatically. The clerk behind Randolph shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her eyes darting between Ava and the judge. Even the opposing counsel avoided meeting Randolph's gaze, his confidence visibly shaken. Randolph cleared his throat, attempting to regain control. Miss Jackson, your speech is noted, but this court is here to rule on the facts, not to indulge your personal grievances. Ava didn't miss a beat. Then let's talk about the facts, she said. The facts are that my landlord violated state law. The facts are that I have provided evidence, witnesses, and legal precedent to support my case. And the fact, Your Honor, is that dismissing this case would only further prove the very prejudice I've just described. Her words were a challenge, daring him to act against her now that the courtroom's attention was squarely on him. Randolph's jaw tightened, his gaze darting toward the clerk, then the spectators, and finally back to Ava. For a moment, it seemed as though he might double down, dismissing the case out of sheer spite. But the weight of the room pressed down on him, and he knew there was no escaping the scrutiny now. With a begrudging sigh, he leaned forward. This court, he said through clenched teeth, finds in favor of the plaintiff, Ava Jackson. The defendant is ordered to provide immediate restitution and comply with all legal tenant protections. The room erupted in applause, the tension finally breaking. Randolph slammed his gavel again, but the sound was drowned out by the cheers and claps of the spectators. Ava exhaled deeply, relief washing over her as she allowed herself a small, triumphant smile. As the judge retreated behind his bench, his face a mask of humiliation, Ava gathered her belongings. She glanced at the gallery, nodding briefly to the older woman who had silently supported her throughout the trial. Justice had been served, but more importantly, Ava had shown everyone in that room, Randolph included, that strength and resilience could break through even the most entrenched prejudice. The soundbite spread like wildfire. A local news reporter caught the courtroom's most explosive moment on camera, capturing Ava Jackson's words as she stood tall against Judge Randolph Wallace. Within hours, the video was trending on social media. People all over the country watched as Ava dismantled not just the judge's arrogance, but the very biases embedded in the system. She's a hero, one tweet read, accompanied by a clip of Ava delivering her impassioned speech. Another post declared, "This is what justice looks like." The hashtags #, Justice for Ava, and #, Systemic Bias trended for days, sparking conversations about judicial accountability. By the following morning, the local courthouse was swarmed with reporters. Microphones and cameras were thrust forward as Ava stepped out, the sunlight bouncing off her modest yet confident demeanor. She held her head high, her hand instinctively resting on her pregnant belly. "Ms. Jackson, how do you feel about the verdict?" one journalist called out. "Do you think Judge Wallace will face consequences?" another shouted. Ava paused, turning to face the crowd. Her voice, calm yet resolute, carried over the noise. "This isn't just about one case or one judge," she said. "This is about ensuring that our legal system serves everyone equally, regardless of their background or circumstances. I fought for justice today, and I'll continue to fight. For myself, for my child, and for anyone who has been overlooked or dismissed." The crowd erupted into applause, and Ava nodded once before continuing her walk. Meanwhile, inside the courthouse, Judge Wallace sat behind his desk, his head in his hands. The fallout had been swift and merciless. A leaked transcript of his courtroom behavior had ignited a firestorm. Advocacy groups called for his resignation, while his colleagues distanced themselves from him. Judge Wallace's actions were unacceptable and unbecoming of the judicial office, the head of the state's Bar Association said in a public statement. An ethics investigation is underway, and we are committed to holding him accountable. The headlines were unforgiving. Racist judge exposed in courtroom showdown. Pregnant plaintiff humiliates biased judge. Calls grow for Wallace to step down. The final blow came a week later, when Wallace released a terse statement announcing his resignation. I regret that my actions have been misinterpreted, he wrote, though his lack of genuine accountability only fueled public outrage. His career, once marked by unchecked authority, ended in disgrace. For Ava, the days following the trial were a whirlwind. Community leaders reached out to commend her courage, while former clients sent messages of gratitude and admiration. Even strangers stopped her in the grocery store, thanking her for standing up for what was right. But Ava wasn't interested in fame. What mattered to her was the change she could create. One evening, as she sat in her modest apartment, she sorted through old case files, the familiar feeling of purpose igniting within her. Her bar certification was still valid. She had stepped away from the legal world to focus on her family. But now, the fire to return was undeniable. Her decision was made. Ava called an old colleague, a fellow civil rights lawyer, to discuss her plans. By the end of the conversation, she had secured a position at a nonprofit organization dedicated to fighting housing discrimination. You're going to make a real difference, Ava, her colleague had said. That's the goal, she replied, her voice steady with determination. On the day Ava returned to the courthouse to finalize her case, she was met with a quiet sense of triumph. As she walked through the familiar halls, people nodded in acknowledgement. Some smiled, others whispered words of encouragement. When she stepped outside, the crisp autumn air filled her lungs, and she paused at the top of the courthouse steps. The sun cast a golden glow, and she tilted her face toward it, letting its warmth remind her of everything she had overcome. Her gaze shifted to the horizon, her thoughts on the future. She wasn't just a lawyer, a mother, or a woman who had won a single case. She was a force, a reminder that resilience and justice could shatter even the most unyielding barriers. With her head held high and a soft smile playing on her lips, Ava descended the steps. Each step felt like a victory, a testament to the battles she had fought and the lives she would go on to impact. The cameras clicked, the reporters jotted down their notes, and the world watched as Ava Jackson walked forward, toward a brighter future not just for herself, but for everyone she vowed to fight for. Ava's story is a powerful reminder that courage and persistence can dismantle even the strongest walls of injustice. If her fight for fairness inspired you, share this story with others to spread the message of resilience and equality. Have you or someone you know faced discrimination or injustice? Speak up, take action, and remember, you have the power to create change. Together, we can build a world where everyone is treated with the dignity they deserve.